Welcome back to the Controversy Corner, boils and ghouls. In this series, we examine feuds, frauds, lawsuits, and other unsavory events I feel deserve a closer look. I originally started looking into Shocker toys because of an episode I'd done about Rob Schraub's magnum opus, Scud the Disposable Assassin, almost 2 years ago. As an enormous fan, I happened to mention the Scud action figure from Shocker Toys in the video, and that reminded me how much I'd always wanted one. A cursory glance at eBay quickly reminded me why I didn't have one though. Disheartened and frustrated, I couldn't fathom why the prices on the Scud figures were so astronomical. While rare Scud Max merchandise certainly command a premium when it comes to certain stuff, the Shocker Toys regularly fetch 3 figures, and that got me wondering. There had to be a story behind why the toys were so expensive, and as it turned out, my hunch was right. Initially, when I started looking, I couldn't find much of any information about the toys or the mysterious company that had produced them. It was like Shocker Toys had never actually existed, as I would quickly discover there were a number of reasons for this, as well as uncover one of the most complex and intriguing series of scams ever carried out in the comics industry that I've ever heard of. Follow me now down the rabbit's hole of Shocker Toys, more specifically the company's founder, former president, and CEO, Jeff Beckett Jr., who's at the center of an alleged decades-long con preying on unsuspecting comic book artists, creators, and consumers alike in this expanded and updated tale of twisted tawdry and industry trivia, a little video documentary I like to call Shocker Toys, A Monument to Failure. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, hit that like button, think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know, share these videos with your friends, and if you really enjoy what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $5 a month, you get access to tons of exclusive posts and content like uncut interviews, and you can even get your name in the credits. If you want to support the channel but Patreon is not your thing, have no fear. After 2 years of fighting, you can finally sign up for membership right here on YouTube. Just hit the little join button and select the tier and perks that fit you best. You can also make donations towards specific goals or just hit the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description below. And if that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen. But now, let's get into it. You may notice the word allegedly quite a bit in tonight's episode. This is not because I have any question whether what I'm talking about happened. I am in fact quite confident that what I'm reporting here is the whole truth, or at least as close to it as I could find. Everything's been rigorously researched and vetted as per usual. Then why the word alleged, you might wonder? Well, that's because while he's been slandered by the best of them, at the time of recording this updated video in 2022, Jeff Beckett Jr. has never been officially convicted of any crime that I'm aware of. I was unable to find the exact details or results pertaining to the single lawsuit brought against him. As he was never jailed, no convictions ever made public, I can only surmise the case was either dismissed or settled. Despite never having been jailed or convicted of any actual crime that I'm aware of, if you Google Shocker Toys, almost nothing comes up. At least not about the toy company directly. What does come up is article after article accusing Shocker Toys founder and CEO Jeff Beckett Jr. of just about every unsavory business practice out there short of blatant robbery by a number of people who did business with Shocker and Beckett. There's also forum after forum filled with customers who have beef with Beckett about product that they never received, and incredibly, it doesn't stop there. There's also warnings and tales of artists and creators who never received payment for use of their characters or even the merchandise that they were promised by Shocker Toys and Jeff Beckett as part of compensation. While there's a myriad of untoward and nasty things about Jeff Beckett that bubble to the surface, even from a cursory look into the company's history, the most glaring as well as most often repeated and discussed is people who paid for but never received merchandise from Shocker Toys, as I mentioned before. Notice I didn't say allegedly there, by the way. This fact isn't in question. It's actually a matter of excruciatingly public and open record. What's so interesting and makes Shocker Toys really stand out, however, isn't the fact that they failed to deliver on product. A lot of companies have done that. What's so unique in Shocker and Beckett's case is that these claims, all chronicled in dated forum and social media posts, aren't just from a certain crowdfunding campaign or anything as is often the case today. Instead, they span more than a decade to date, and they don't just come from individuals either. There are plenty of retailers that have had less than pleasant experiences with and less than kind things to say about Shocker Toys, and more specifically owner and operator Jeff Beckett Jr. There are entire online forums and communities that have been set up and painstakingly maintained to try and help people who never received goods get refunds, or at the very least the toys they ordered from Beckett under different companies and aliases, no matter how long it takes. These communities are also seemingly quite intent on exposing the proprietor of Shocker Toys, Jeff Beckett Jr., as a fraud, a liar, and a thief as well in many cases. You don't see that level of dedication to absolutely obliterating not just a company, but a specific individual with such rabid intensity, tenacity, and intelligence quite often. It really takes some doing to piss people off that bad. When I was researching this video initially, I really tried to go in without any presumptions about anything though. I didn't know who Jeff Beckett was at that time, his history, or why people were still so worked up all these years later. I've seen my fair share of online witch hunts, and I'm willing to give someone the benefit of the doubt, especially when researching a piece like this. When perusing the articles and posts describing all these outlandish and, to be quite honest, nearly unbelievable things that he's allegedly done, you quickly develop a very clear mental image of Jeff Beckett Jr. as this sort of inarticulate, basement-dwelling, sociopathic troglodyte, incapable of human interaction and only concerned with scamming as many people for as much money as he possibly can, though. He's allegedly given some of the most off-the-wall and, to be blunt, insane and strange excuses for not delivering product that I've ever heard. I had a hard time swallowing some of the stuff I came across during a cursory examination of Shocker and Beckett, and trust me, you will not believe some of the stuff this guy allegedly said and did. However, because Shocker was still a relatively small company when the ugliness started, and Beckett quickly retreated from the public eye for a number of reasons, there's not a ton of interviews out there with him. It took a little digging, but when I did finally manage to find an interview with him, Beckett was anything but what I expected, though. A well-spoken man with a seemingly logical answer for any questions tossed at him, Beckett would almost impossibly win over just about every interviewer he dealt with, even those who had gone in with the very intention of tearing him apart and exposing him as a fraud. At least in the beginning. If you watch the few surviving interviews with him that I know of, Beckett really does come off as a pretty likable and relatable guy at first. It was obvious, however, he was working an extremely well-rehearsed bit of kayfabe the more you saw and heard him speak. It didn't matter what people asked him about, why he was there, or what was happening. Beckett would somehow manage to find a way to launch into a speech that would come to define Shocker and Jeff Beckett to those that would defend him for years to come. He would repeat over and over that he was just a regular guy with a dream to make really cool action figures without the help of a multi-million-dollar conglomerate to meddle with the designs and license choices. A lot of people told him his dream was impossible, and it might sound radical today, but at the time, a lot of people legit thought Beckett was crazy for thinking he could do something like this virtually on his own. And there's no question it was a massive undertaking. However, while Beckett was fine with receiving adulation for the successes he did manage to succeed in, he was never very good at taking personal responsibility for his company or his own actions for that matter. From the very inception of Shocker Toys, Beckett would insist that the world was somehow set against him, conspiring first to derail his toy line and then so thoroughly slander his name it would ensure he would never work in the industry again. If this sounds a little far-fetched, that's because it is. That's not to say Beckett didn't have some valid points. He said that the most likely reason people were trying to destroy him and shut down his operation was because he was a threat to much larger and more expensive to maintain toy manufacturers. These multi-million-dollar companies couldn't afford to admit that one person could do what it took the efforts of their entire company and a significant amount of money for them to accomplish. And when you hear it that way, he almost doesn't sound like a raving paranoid lunatic. I think I also really wanted to believe Jeff Beckett Jr. when he said it at the time. I wanted him to be telling the truth, and I wanted to see him succeed. Beckett seemed genuinely passionate, and at least some of the stuff he said seemed to make sense. While today, highly posable action figures aren't just out there, they're the norm. In 2000, minifigures were still extremely limited in their mobility, in juxtaposition to a lot of companies that were still recycling molds and tired, played-out concepts left over from the heyday and ensuing glut of the 80s. The Scud figure is not only one of the most accurate comic book figures ever produced, the way you could pose that toy was like nothing I had ever seen at that time. If you could get the right balance, you could mimic any number of the impossibly contorted images in which creator Rob Schrab would often place his reluctant anti-hero. The sheer movement the figure is capable of is still something to behold even today, honestly. As a fan of statues over figures because of their accuracy to a large extent, to the design and aesthetics of the character, the Scud figure in particular is a gorgeous one from top to bottom. It was produced with excruciating attention to detail on nearly every level, and I still think it's probably my favorite action figure ever released. Jeff Beckett designed the articulation himself. He came up with the designs, secured the licenses, handled production of the figures on every level, himself, alone. While there's obviously some exaggeration to these claims, if only a fraction of this is true, if only a shard of the truth is that only a handful of people actually made up Shocker, which from everything that I've uncovered, I actually think it is. This story is a travesty on so many levels. Despite its magnificence to behold, the Scud figure was plagued by problems due to exceedingly cheap and poor manufacturing, and beyond that, the figures were basically never commercially available on any real scale to fans or retailers. On top of this, Beckett has so successfully sabotaged his career and destroyed his reputation at this point that his talents will almost certainly remain squandered. Say what you want about the company or even the guy behind it, but he's designed some great looking figures over the years. Even if he were capable of designing another figure as well thought out and beautiful as Scud though, there's basically no one out there dumb enough to pay him for one, let alone help him get the toy actually made. But don't worry, we'll get to all of that in good time. Every figure that Beckett managed to get out, regardless of the company's name or the alias Beckett was employing at the time, there's only one thing that Beckett most certainly isn't lying about. He did it all himself, without any help from the big boys like Toy Biz or Mattel. Limited as they might have been, and rife with all sorts of problems, Jeff Beckett says that companies like Mattel and Toy Biz didn't like that he was able to get anything out at all. They allegedly didn't like this so much that they wanted to shut him down, which is actually pretty plausible when you think about it, but was there actually any truth to Beckett's claims? They sabotaged his company and reputation. Was the world just out to get him from the start? Had people simply been swayed by yellow journalism, painting Jeff Beckett as a lying psychopath out to swindle anyone and everyone that he could manage to sink his hooks into? Alas, this is not the case for Shocker Toys or Jeff Beckett Jr. himself. If anything, the tales don't do him justice. They almost never capture the incredible scale, scope, and time frame which Jeff Beckett operated in and is still operating under. Sadly, I can say that from my research, gifted though he may be, Jeff Beckett seems intent on using his intelligence, time, and energy on nothing more than being a con man. His greed and avarice crippling any chances the talented young man might once have had at success over and over again. The story of Jeff Beckett Jr. and Shocker Toys is a strange and complicated one. So let's start at the beginning, shall we? Now, Jeff Beckett Jr. started Shocker Toys right around 2000. Or he didn't. I don't say this because the date or the formation is in question, but because the fact of whether or not he actually started the company would change according to accounts by Beckett himself. It basically depended on if he wanted to take the credit for forming and operating the up-and-coming Shocker Toys or attempt to distance himself from the company for an increasing myriad of reasons, many of which will become painfully evident the further we get into our tale tonight. It's also unknown whether Jeff Beckett Jr. started the company on his own, as he sometimes boasted during Shocker's better days, or with partners, as he later claimed, as things grew increasingly turbulent for the young entrepreneur and his numerous business endeavors. I don't know whether Jeff Beckett started the company alone, but I do know there were two partners legally involved in running Shocker by the time that the crap really hit the fan. It's unclear if they were there from the beginning or if they were conned by Beckett and his charismatic and seemingly well thought out pitches into partnering investing in the company at some later date. While I might not be able to tell you the particulars of everyone involved when they started, I can say for sure that Jeff Beckett Jr. and Shocker Toys began production of their first real toy line in 2002, the customizable robot figures Beckett dubbed Shockinis. Distributed locally, mostly at video game and comic shops, the Shockinis helped Beckett get his foot in the door and garnered a decent amount of attention despite their resemblance to another toy on the market at the time, Stickfas. Beckett was interviewed and his toys featured on at least one ABC News broadcast at the time of the Shockinis release, and the line would go on to be one of the few cornerstones that Beckett was able to fall back on during hard times. There were comparisons drawn to another similar customizable robot line which came out around the same time, Stickfas as I mentioned, but Beckett denied claims he had swiped the idea, and despite this negative press, the Shockinis line were important for a number of reasons for both Shocker and Jeff Beckett. They might have helped Shocker get off the ground, but the real reason I bring up Shockinis, though, is that they're physical proof that Jeff Beckett is, in fact, capable of producing an actual toy. Because trust me, this fact is going to come into real question quick. While they helped Beckett enter the toy market for the first time after the failure of his SAF for shoulder action figures completely bombed in 2002, failing to reach production for a host of reasons, the Shockinis were also extremely important because as Shocker gained a modicum of momentum and capital, the line allowed Jeff Beckett to move in a direction that would irrevocably alter his life and change his career in the toy business forever. Licensing. Signing a deal with Troma Films after less than 3 years in the toy market, Shocker Toys created a licensed properties line of Shockinis in order to produce a Toxic Avenger figure. From Toxic Avenger, Shocker and Beckett quickly moved to expand their license line, including any and every character they thought they could afford and would turn a quick buck. One of the more interesting Shockinis released was Cade, Sean O'Reilly and Arcana's first ever character. While Shocker was able to involve a surprising amount of characters over the years, even from the beginning, long before pre-sales for non-existent merchandise and the disastrous Indie Spotlight series, fans noted there were major problems with some of Shocker Toys', shall we say, questionable tactics when it came to licensing. Most notably, when Shocker did a Solar Man of the Atom Shockini, diehard fans explained at length to Jeff Beckett there were several distinct differences in the original Del Gold Key Solar costume and the more recent and unarguably more popular Valiant Comics version. While Valiant had ceased to be by the time of the Solar Shockinis, Valiant fans have always been an intelligent and ardent group of individuals. They never seemed to give up on their properties, and they genuinely loved the characters and creators. It's actually really refreshing to see in the rather toxic world of ultra fandom that I encounter sometimes. While many of the Valiant characters hung in perpetual publication limbo, the company was in complete shambles as well. Since licensing the Valiant versions of the Del Gold Key characters became almost impossible, Valiant fans were somewhat surprised when they saw the Solar Shockini. The version of the character Shocker had used, modeled after the distinctive Valiant costume, was obviously not based on the Dell Gold Key version, which Shocker had in fact licensed. Despite having these differences explained to him on at least one Valiant message board in no uncertain terms, Beckett either didn't get or didn't care what was being told to him. Despite some fan outcry, with the remnants of Valiant's creators and controlling fractions distracted with protracted legal disputes over characters and rights, production went ahead with the Shocker toys Valiant-styled Solar Man and the Atom Shockinis, despite not having the rights to him, and Jeff Beckett actually going so far as to say he was, quote, confused as to why Shocker couldn't use the Valiant version in the first place. Honestly, the rights to the Valiant universe were, and still are in some cases from what I understand, just a complete logistic nightmare. They took professional lawyers years to sort out, so I might have been able to forgive this mix-up and chalk it up to just that. An honest mistake. Maybe he was too far along with production to change stuff. Shocker was a small company after all, and maybe he legitimately didn't understand that using a completely different version of a character that you've licensed is something of a big deal. Maybe it was an honest mistake. As time went on, however, it would become glaringly evident that this was not the case. In fact, as time progressed, rights and licensing would only become more and more dubious topics for Shocker Toys, and more specifically Jeff Beckett Jr. in his many alleged guises and incarnations. Following the Shockinis line branching out into licensed properties with Troma, Dell, and others such as Arcana, apparently word began to spread of the ambitious upstart toy company. Shortly after, Shocker got their first real shot at success in 2006, when they were directly approached by the band to create a series of GWAR action figures for the cult rock group as part of their upcoming world tour. GWAR is not only world famous, but their merchandising is a big part of the band's identity and how they market themselves and make money. They're kind of like Kiss. They developed a kind of brand for themselves over the years, and a lot of fans of the band are die-hard collectors of anything and everything GWAR. This could have been Beckett's big break, honestly. As would often prove to be the case, though, he wantonly squandered the opportunity and sullied his name for the first time in the process. The toys, which would never actually see production, certainly didn't jumpstart his career like he probably anticipated, but they did spawn what would become something of an annual tradition for Beckett, one he would continue with throughout all of his many companies and names. Beckett decided that rather than produce finished products with all of that overhead where you have to share the profits with investors and reimburse the people whose characters you're licensing, he would instead represent Shocker Toys by setting up a booth at the 2006 San Diego Comic-Con stocked with a sweaty armful of unfinished, cheaply produced prototypes that he would instead simply pocket the cash for himself without having to tell anyone. Allegedly, of course, that is. These kind of backdoor and rather questionable business practices would come to typify Shocker and Beckett for that matter in the years to come. In 2006, the year they were supposed to debut their highly detailed and touted GWAR figures, Shocker instead only had an unpainted GWAR resin statue, a couple of half-completed GWAR Shockini prototypes, and ironically, a super skinny 7-inch figure prototype of band member Beefcake for sale. Fans were not impressed, to say the least, and Shocker ended up taking a beating online for the poor quality of their offerings at San Diego that year. Despite the prototype's poor critical reception and the fact the line never even saw production due to delay after supposed delay, the buzz that built up around their proposed GWAR figures somehow allowed Shocker to begin work on their next proposed line of figures. While Beckett believed that this was the idea that he had started the company for, the project would in fact ultimately lead to Shocker Toys undoing and then redoing and then undoing again. And well, you get the idea. The legendarily ill-fated as well as equally sought after and infamous Indie Spotlight series. Sometime in late 2005 or early 2006, despite the continued production problems with the GWAR line, Shocker managed to parlay the momentum that they were getting with that press into the most ambitious project to date. When the Indie Spotlight series was originally announced, it was going to include something like 6 characters. Quickly, it was 9, then 12. Before it was all said and done, there were supposed to have been more than 30 characters in the original proposed series, which Beckett had supposedly gotten the licenses to. And that's not counting innumerable other announcements made later, many of which even made it to the prototype phase and were posted to various websites. At the time it was announced, I had literally never seen anything like it before. I missed the Mego craze by a few years, and the supposed final lineup for the first wave of figures alone was to include the Max, Solar Man of the Atom, Magnus Robot Fighter, Dick Tracy, Jack Staff, Madman, Witchblade, Darkness, Nexus, the Toxic Avenger, the Phantom, Scud the Disposable Assassin, Grimjack, and Cyberforce, as well as some other independent heavy hitters like the Tick. The series wasn't just announced at a convention or anything either. They were actually solicited in Diamond's Previews catalog, which by this time in 2008 had become the Bible from which your local shop ordered product. I remember being totally aghast when I saw the solicitation and having to actually beg my parents for money to put down on a special order for a lot of those figures. Months passed and the figures never showed though. Eventually there was a final resolicitation in previews and then nothing, not a word. I didn't really do much shopping online at the time, preferring to keep my business at brick and mortar stores as I still do, so I had no idea of the absolute shit show that was brewing with Shocker during this time. All I knew was that I never heard another word about the figures. Eventually, I rolled the money I'd put down on the figures into a book that was way out of my price league and my parents would have never let me buy. As happy as I was to have that first appearance of Gambit, I really wanted those toys. I hounded the LCS and stalked the previews catalogs, but never came across anything else. And eventually, I just kind of assumed that they never actually ended up getting made. And as it turned out, I was half right. Of the more than 32 figures originally announced for the Shocker Toys Indie Spotlight series, less than 12 would ever actually see production, and those would be spaced out over a number of years, waves, lines, and companies. If you sift through Facebook posts, forums, and web archives like I did, you can find maybe 20 more figures that were announced and entered the finalized prototype phase but were never released for one reason or another as well, basically all boiling down to money from what I can gather, plagued by setbacks and production delays from the very beginning, all of which seemed to somehow involve bizarre and curious circumstances that Jeff Beckett claimed were totally out of his control. The Indie Spotlight series quickly began to fall further and further and further behind schedule, almost as quickly as new characters were being announced. As the delays continued, the original lineup was eventually trimmed to a much more streamlined and seemingly manageable 5 characters. Scud the Disposable Assassin, the Max, Kabuki, Kachu, and Shadowhawk. People were starting to talk though. While I wasn't aware of it while it was occurring, utilizing the Wayback Machine and forum archives, you can glimpse back at the chatter among fans during the continual setbacks and cancellations that plagued the Indie Spotlight series. Some people were really sold on the persona that Jeff Beckett was trying to present, and in the beginning it wasn't hard to be one of them. While there were innumerable delays, he was extremely vocal and communicative at the time and would take any opportunity to talk about the limitations that he was facing because, as an individual running Shocker Toys, he wasn't a giant conglomerate or company. Beckett began to claim around this time that production plants in the United States were showing preferential treatment to larger companies producing their own figures, and that he was being forced to seek manufacturers outside of the US as a result. He said that companies, especially guys like Toy Biz, were essentially crowding him out of the manufacturing plants and being shown preferential treatment because of the size of their accounts comparatively. There's no doubt that someone is going to show preferential treatment to a multi-million-dollar client versus a boutique company run by a few guys ordering a couple thousand units at a time. This made sense. Some of Beckett's other claims that he began to make, and what really feels like a growing sense of desperation, however, let's just say they didn't all quite add up. Regardless, Beckett was emphatic that all he wanted to do was make toys, and not just any toys, good toys. And to hear him say it, it almost sounded like the truth. As the months ticked by, and people continued to talk online, however, there was another growing faction of people. These people were not buying what Jeff Beckett was selling. Many of these early detractors were actually either creators or other individuals that had some sort of business dealing with Jeff Beckett. This should be a telltale sign. This story is about to get ugly. While the delays were initially damaging in the sense that Shocker was quickly running out of steam building on the non-existent GWAR line, another problem started to arise as the months ticked by. The licensing agreements that Beckett had signed with a lot of people were starting to expire. Tired of his excuses and some with other offers on the table, many of those creatives ended up licensing their characters out to other much larger companies instead. The same companies that Beckett had alleged were responsible for the initial delays. The delays which had caused him to outsource production overseas and set the company back months and cost them precious capital. While the figures ended up getting licensed to a host of other companies, a great deal of them were directly picked up by Toy Biz. Toy Biz subsequently released said licenses in what they dubbed the legendary comic book heroes line. Yet, like I said, some of the stuff Jeff Beckett was saying was true, and it was hard to ignore at the time. As Toy Biz continued to pick up his former licenses and clients, releasing figures that Beckett had originally touted for his own Indie Spotlight series under their own obviously derivative line, Beckett became progressively agitated, and as he grew more outraged, he also began to become increasingly vocal about what he felt was an obvious incursion on his own creative endeavors. And to be fair, this time Jeff Beckett had a point. It wasn't hard to figure out where the idea for Toy Biz's legendary comic book heroes line had come from. I have no doubt that they were indeed doing precisely what Jeff Beckett was alleging in this case. That being said, it wasn't like he was actually doing anything with the licenses anyways. That's how Toy Biz was getting all the scraps Beckett seemed so upset by. While the licenses had lapsed because Jeff Beckett had proven unable to do anything with them, this didn't stop there from being an ensuing wave of both media and fan attention on the situation. Looking in from the outside, it really was starting to look like Jeff Beckett might have been telling the truth all along. Toy Biz and a few of the other larger toy companies might actually be trying to squeeze the upstart company out of the equation before they ever got a chance to get product out on the shelves in some unsettling ways. Many who had lived through the glut of releases by Marvel in the 80s designed to absolutely obliterate any and all competition by sheer numbers and a deluge of titles, and those who saw exactly what was going on took to the internet. Suddenly, the tides seemed to shift in Shocker and Beckett's favor, at least for the moment. Beckett wisely utilized the widespread coverage of this plight as a way to talk about the Indie Spotlight series to a much wider audience of people and attract interest from others who most certainly had never even heard of the company and never would have had it not been for the public battle with Toy Biz rather than dwell on the lost properties or talk about going to war with the larger players. The one way that Beckett acknowledged the situation directly was usually by adding that this was just another example of the shady, underhanded practices that competing toy companies have been employing since day one to prevent Shocker from getting toys onto the stands, and about how he had been telling the truth. They were dead set on stomping out Jeff Beckett, who was himself supposedly hell-bent on proving you didn't need a corporate juggernaut behind you to produce quality action figures. It was during this period, though, that when pressed for details about exactly what was actually happening with the Indie Spotlight series, the Beckett's answers began to become increasingly erratic and bizarre. It had been years, and Shocker hadn't produced any true retail product to produce income for the company. Questions arose about where the money was coming from and if there was in fact any money at all anymore. This is when the tales about stolen molds, Chinese warehouse sabotage, and theft on the high seas began. Beckett was losing his cool more and more, and when he did address actual concerns about the company or his own business practices, he was defensive and didn't make much sense in a lot of cases. While he was somehow keeping the company afloat with money from God only knows where for the time being, the cracks were beginning to show for both Shocker and Jeff Beckett as 2006 came to a close. Then, while still riding the wave of public sympathy and moral indignation from the Toy Biz legendary comic book hero situation, what could have once again been Shocker's salvation arrived, albeit from a very unlikely source. Likely due directly to the press exposure around this time, the production company behind Stan Lee's Who Wants to Be a Superhero reality television series recruited Shocker Toys to produce the feedback character figure for the show. While his legacy might not have been what it once was, anything that has Stan Lee's name even associated with it is going to garner attention from a large portion of the comics community. Originally, Stan Lee had tried to sell the show to MTV, but they lost interest before signing anything. The show eventually made its way to the Sci-Fi Channel, where it aired for 2 seasons, starting in July of 2006, I believe. From what I understand, Sci-Fi was only mildly interested in the show originally. That is, until they discovered Stan Lee would be the judge, at which point they quickly snapped it up and raced into development. If you're unfamiliar like I was, the basic idea behind Who Wants to Be a Superhero was that a bunch of random people would come and audition as their invented superhero alter egos. From these initial entrants, Lee would select a smaller group of 10 people who he would put into a house with each other and force to compete in challenges designed to test their, quote, superhero qualities. The winning character would then be featured in both a comic book scripted by Stan Lee, who acted as the sole judge on the show, and a sci-fi original movie. The interesting thing, at least to me, is the comic Stan Lee would be scripting wasn't for Marvel Comics, but Dark Horse instead. Lee was so disassociated with the publishing branch of Marvel by this point, having only been acting as a kind of comic book emissary for the company for decades, and having just sued the parent company in 2002 for failure of payment, Lee didn't have the pull to make a book for the show happen at Marvel. While it was nothing earth-shattering, the first season of Who Wants to Be a Superhero did well enough it was quickly renewed for a second season. To help promote this fact and raise awareness about the show, production came up with another interesting idea to help promote the series. If you were going to do a comic book and a movie, why not go the extra mile and just make an action figure as well? So it was in 2006 that during the interim between the first and second season of Who Wants to Be a Superhero, at the height of media coverage and fan discussion of Shocker Toys' publicized defeat at the hands of corporate Goliath's Toy Biz, that it was officially announced the winner of the show would also have their very own action figure produced by the underdog company Shocker Toys themselves as well. The feedback figure which Shocker was to produce was discussed in detail and eventually announced on the show, as well as other major media outlets and magazines like TV Guide. The once obscure toy company was quickly thrust into the public eye, warts and all. The resulting press and renewed interest in the company narrowly rescued Shocker Toys from the brink of oblivion once more, but their lease on life would be short-lived if they couldn't manage to get actual product out to people. And worse yet, there were starting to be troubling talks about questionable business practices on Beckett's end. After innumerable setbacks and several failed attempts at breaking into the industry, people were finally starting to take notice of the tiny underdog that seemed poised to make a big splash. Months passed with no word on the Who Wants to Be a Superhero feedback figure following its announcement, though. It seemed like this would be another of Shocker's hollow, unfulfilled promises. That is, until prototypes of the figure feedback, along with the Shockini versions of several other cast members, popped up as, you guessed it, San Diego Comic-Con exclusives a year and some change later in 2008. In the annual tradition for Beckett, regardless of what he was calling the company or what kind of hot water he might have been at the time, the prototypes weren't just for showing off. As always, they were for sale. Despite having early production prototypes of Who Wants to Be a Superhero figures on hand for sale at San Diego Comic-Con, they weren't Shocker's main attraction at the booth that year. Somehow, despite all of the problems they'd encountered, despite not being able to actually get toys out, somehow Shocker had managed to enter into talks and ink a deal with Adult Swim to produce Metalocalypse figures for the then wildly popular show, which had premiered only a short time before in mid-2006. Shocker were one of the first to get in on the licensing for Metalocalypse, which would subsequently explode in popularity over the next several years, not only inspiring the episodes to double in length and a move to a much more prominent airing position, but eventually culminating in one of the show's creators, Brendan Small, doing actual live concerts and tours performing as the cartoon's fictional band Death Clock, who have even recorded and released several albums and a movie to boot. The show was a goldmine, and people were hungry for merch. The Metalocalypse figures could have both saved Shocker toys and simultaneously put them on the map if they played their cards right. Instead, Jeff Beckett Jr. would prove to be his own worst enemy once more, and licensing issues quickly arose. But this wasn't some simple mistake like subtle differences in Solar's costume. This time, Beckett would drag Shocker toys kicking and screaming back into the limelight and tarnish the young company's reputation nearly beyond repair. While showing up with a sweaty armful of poorly produced merchandise that you explain away as prototypes to placate critics and avoid paying people who are destroying your cheap plastic product anywhere and everywhere that they can, isn't going to get you into trouble necessarily, it isn't very professional either, and it certainly isn't going to win you any fans with critics or consumers for that matter. But ultimately, neither the exceedingly poor quality of their product or unprofessional conduct as a company proved to be the real problem at San Diego Comic-Con that year. The real problem was that Jeff Beckett had for some reason decided it would be acceptable to sell said prototypes at the Shocker toy booth that year once again when dealing with a much larger company. He wasn't dealing with forgiving independent comic book creators, he was dealing with a real company. When they learned of what he was doing, to say that Adult Swim was not happy is putting it lightly. Not only was Adult Swim cheese, they weren't getting a cut of anything Beckett made off of the quote prototype figures, but they claimed Beckett didn't even have the license to produce the vinyl figures. The deal with Shocker had apparently extended only to action figures, and the immobile 5-inch vinyl prototypes they'd created didn't fall into that category for a number of reasons, though to be fair, the concept of rights, IPs, and especially paying people always seemed to be rather elusive and confusing for Beckett. With their bridges to Adult Swim burnt, what's really crazy is that apparently Adult Swim weren't the only ones who had agreed to work with Shocker Toys following the media exposure the company had seen, while Beckett raised a public stink about Toy Biz's supposed underhanded treatment of the company, and Who Wants to Be a Superhero getting their brand name in houses across the nation. While the long-touted and endlessly delayed Indie Spotlight series lineup was constantly undergoing changes, especially following Toy Biz snaking several of the big-name licenses for their own legendary comic book heroes superheroes line, there were some comic characters that were actually getting added to the line. Shockingly, all pun intended, none of the Metalocalypse figures would ever reach mass production, or for that matter, ever be seen outside of the 2008 San Diego Comic-Con, to my knowledge. Bizarrely though, two of the last-minute additions to the line, Sam Keith's The Max and Rob Schraub's Scud the Disposable Assassin, would be the first figures to ever actually see production. Although, much like with the Metalocalypse figures, not in the final form discussed in the licenses, as I understand. As always, Jeff Beckett simply couldn't wait for the final figures to see production before he started showing stuff off, and more importantly, selling it. The mold for Scud seems to have been nearly completed. If you look closely, you can even see where the joints and stuff are going to be. In 2008, a year before the official launch of the already long overdue Indie Spotlight Series Wave 1, the figure was nowhere near ready for mass market, though. The figure was completely inarticulate. The paint was a thick, cheap mess and cracked and flaked, and even getting the figures to stand up proved so problematic that a base had to be created to prop it up for display and sale at that year's Shocker booth. And for sale it was. To further conceal the cheap nature of the toy, Beckett designed an ingeniously clever trap to ensure that even people who bought the toy wouldn't know just how cheap and poorly produced it was, at least until they got home. Beckett created a flimsy cardboard replica of the vending machines where you purchased Scud units in the comic series in an effort to make the packaging part of the toy's presentation and thereby dissuade anyone from actually opening them. That being said, it was beyond smart. While cheap and disposable, having the vending machine really helped set the toy off and helped to sell a lot of toys. He might allegedly be a cheat and a liar of monumental proportions, but never let it be said that Beckett cannot sometimes be rather clever. Or at least that he doesn't surround himself with clever people, as I've no proof Beckett came up with this idea himself. The Max also made an appearance at the Shocker toy booth that year in San Diego, but they didn't even have an inarticulate prototype mold of that figure yet. Because of this, they produced a 3-inch vinyl figure limited to 500 pieces instead. I should state for the record though, of all the numerous examples of this figure that I've seen come up on eBay and other secondhand markets over the years, which is a lot, not a single one of them has ever been numbered. I guess maybe Jeff Beckett and company could simply have been too busy to actually number the figures, but I don't buy that. I don't know why you would design packaging that way and then not number it, unless, of course, you didn't want people to catch on to the fact there were actually more than 500 of these made, or at least leave the door open to produce more than 500 if you wanted. I can't prove this fact, but let's just call it an alleged hunch. The other interesting thing to note here is that while it may have been rushed and cheaply produced, Beckett was, as always, an astute businessman and designed both the Scud and Max figures featured at San Diego Comic-Con that year so as to allow them to create numerous variants to sucker any poor sap that hadn't caught on to the game Beckett was playing into after a few years into buying multiple copies of a single character from the company. The Max figure would later show up with, quote, battle damage as a Hastings exclusive, and there's at least 4 variants of the Scud figure that I know of, which this inarticulate Comic-Con exclusive is actually one of technically. Another interesting thing to note here is, while Jeff Beckett had basically founded Shocker Toys on the idea of dealing with independent and lesser-known comic book creators in order to produce figures for characters that you simply wouldn't see from other companies, the Max wasn't licensed through Sam Keith. That was through MTV. The Metalocalypse deal had been with Cartoon Network, and Beckett was promising chain department store distribution for the Indie Spotlight figures when they did eventually come out. None of this aligned with the principles it seemed Beckett had sold people on when it came to Shocker. It happened this wasn't the only thing Beckett was doing that didn't really fit with this aesthetic and idea either. While licenses came and went, figures were announced and never released, forgotten and then resurrected in an endless cycle. It became difficult to understand how Beckett was even able to afford these feats. Behind the scenes, it turned out he was making deals that I literally don't understand. I mean, I can fathom coming up with them on Beckett's end, but I don't know how in the hell he actually got people, let alone companies, to agree. And not stupid people. Beckett conned some intelligent and well-guarded folks in the independent circle with what seems like an extremely one-sided deal to me. The basic idea was this. Because Beckett was the small guy and assuming most of the risk, it turns out he wasn't even paying for the licensing rights to these characters. In lieu of upfront payment, when the figures saw production, Beckett allegedly agreed to send samples and comp copies of them to the creatives behind the characters, as well as money when they started turning a profit. If you're putting out your own comic book or you simply don't have any other offers on the table, I can see maybe taking someone up on this kind of offer if they seemed like they were seriously on the up and up and I had paperwork to back it up, and I at least knew them and they had a track record. This makes the fact that properties like the Max, which was directly licensed through MTV, really puzzling though. I can see perhaps bamboozling Terry Moore on his own, but I don't know how Beckett possibly walked away room full of sharks and talked his way into licensing stuff like the Max without paying up front, which he simply couldn't afford to do. It just goes to show that the people who got and are still getting taken by Geoff Beckett aren't as dumb as you might think. You really have to know what you're saying and doing to take MTV to the cleaners like this. Viacom has some of the most bloodthirsty, vicious lawyers on the planet in their employ. This also points to the fact that in reality, Beckett was most likely highly skilled and knowledgeable about licensing specifically. Sadly, this level of intelligence certainly never extended to the operation of Shocker or any of his other companies for that matter. Consumed in what had to be an ever-expanding web of lies and deception of his own design, Beckett was starting to completely lose his grip on the company he had founded only a few years earlier. In a lot of ways, it feels like he was losing touch with reality as well. If mounting trouble with several of the larger companies they had gotten into business with, failure to get product out, vicious reviews of their meager offerings to date, and the quickly souring public image of Shocker toys weren't enough, just following the San Diego Comic-Con snafu with Adult Swim and the resulting threat of possible legal action as a result, it was discovered that the Shocker Toys LLC had expired. Jeff Beckett had apparently failed to file the appropriate paperwork and pay the required fees to operate a business, and the LLC had simply lapsed. That's right. Jeff Beckett Jr. was so cheap, so delusional, and operating so far out on the edge that despite entering into business with the likes of Viacom, he hadn't even bothered to pay to renew his business license. If things were touch and go for Shocker prior to this moment, I don't even know how to describe how precarious their position was afterwards. I don't exactly know how things played out with Adult Swim and the Metalocalypse license, and although there would never be another piece of Shocker Metalocalypse merchandise created, they never took him to court to my knowledge either. I'd also like to say I'm sure Jeff Beckett took care of the Shocker LLC business license, but in all honesty, given what continued to transpire with the company over the next few years, as well as the complete implosion of Jeff Beckett's professional career during this period, I'm not entirely convinced he actually ever did just that. What did Shocker Toys do in the face of constant production and manufacturing problems, the Adult Swim fiasco, and their very publicly discussed LLC license problems, which had all thus far prevented them from even getting product out for actual retail? Why, Shocker Toys announced the expansion of their Indie Spotlight series, of course. Along with comic books, the Indie Spotlight series would also include anime, video game, and movie characters now. Though a few prototypes were created, this idea seems to have been quickly abandoned. Around this time, Beckett also announced plans to release a series of Golden Age comic book characters featuring IPs that have fallen into the public domain and therefore wouldn't cost him a thing to license as a result. They didn't stop there, though. Along with the plans to expand the line, there were even 2-packs announced for as of yet still unreleased figures from the touted Indie Spotlight Series 1, which would feature exclusive variants and be offered at discount prices, planned for release in 2008. Despite their boasting, the constant expansion of their line, and Beckett's insistence that, quote, all he wanted to do was make good toys, not a single one of these figures would ever be produced. By now, there was a growing number of fairly outspoken individuals who wondered if Shocker Toys would ever actually release anything to the mass market. With whatever favorable press they had been able to muster with the Toy Biz affair and the Who Wants to Be a Superhero figure long gone following the Adult Swim debacle, Shocker was quickly becoming a joke. And not just inside of the industry, but to people who had been following their misadventures since the Indie Spotlight series had been announced, many of which had been early proponents of the brand and proposed figures. As the walls began to close in around him, Jeff Beckett again tried to speak out in defense of his company. If his excuses had been strange before, however, things were about to get downright weird. Beckett was usually vague when it came to answering questions about exactly why it seemed virtually impossible for Shocker to get an actual toy on his shelves. But when pressed for details by an increasing number of sources, Beckett was eventually forced to confront the issue several times. He began to come up with some truly bizarre stories. I mentioned it in passing before, but the most notorious of these tales was when Beckett alleged inventory had been stolen from a boat while en route to the US by pirates. Yeah, Jeff Beckett actually publicly stated at one point that his toys had been stolen on the high seas by a roving ship of pirates. The outlandish and obviously untrue nature of many of these claims notwithstanding, the most common excuses that he employed were all essentially variations on a theme. It was a long con that Beckett would continue for years and allegedly make a tidy sum from in the process. Beckett constantly alleged his molds, tooling, and machinery were being, quote, held hostage by nameless Chinese factory workers, albeit for an assortment of reasons at different times. Sometimes the workers were enraged they weren't being paid, while other times it seemed like Beckett was trying to somehow imply that Toy Biz or some other large corporate conglomerate had somehow paid off or otherwise coerced them into hijacking his materials so as to prevent Shocker from ever being a threat to their omnipresence in the American action figure market. As insane as this might sound in retrospect, Jeff Beckett is just clever enough of a guy. He tossed in just enough technical jargon to make things sound plausible to a lot of people who weren't in the know, and to hear him describe the deplorable Chinese production factories he was being forced to work with because of Toy Biz, you really wanted to believe what he was saying, to give him the benefit of the doubt. Again and again, Beckett would talk about how he just wanted to get quality toys into the hands of the consumers who were waiting for them, but how the world seemed destined against him. After several years of excuses, failed launches, innumerable announcements that never led anywhere, and poorly produced merchandise he tried to play off as prototypes, though, Beckett was obviously playing on people's last nerve. The public opinion of the company had begun to turn, and not in Beckett or Shocker's favor as it had in the past. As stuff like his piracy story began to make the rounds online, the word was getting out about just how Beckett was actually running Shocker toys. It seemed as though the jig may finally have been up for the fly-by-night operation. As is often the case with Beckett, however, he was far from out of the fight, and what followed, especially given how badly the company was struggling and tarnished their reputation, was kind of defies logic in many regards. By 2009, years after the announcement about the Indie Spotlight series, and just when it seemed like the veil might be torn off of the illusion that was Shocker Toys, miraculously and almost without warning, after innumerable revisions of the lineup, countless delays, and no small amount of legal trouble, Wave 1 was finally released that same year. At least kind of. As it happened, even though toys were finally being produced, a lot of people still couldn't get their hands on them. See, the thing was, distribution for the Indie Spotlight series was iffy to say the least. As I mentioned, the line had been solicited in Diamond's Preview magazine, which was essentially the master catalog of upcoming releases and toys that the direct market comic book retailers ordered their stuff from by this point. At some time between their original solicitation in 2008 and their heavily delayed actual release in 2009, Diamond had some sort of really nasty falling out with Jeff Beckett for one reason or another, though. While I've heard of Diamond being rather snooty when it comes to who and what they solicit with little rhyme or reason, it's rare they get into it with people like they did with Beckett. I'm guessing it had to do with poor communication and lazy excuses as to why the toys were being delayed, teamed with his growing reputation and damaged public image, but that's just a guess. Diamond didn't just cancel orders from the solicitation, from what I understand, though. They completely refused to distribute any Shocker merchandise. I don't know quite what Beckett did to piss them off so bad, but he definitely managed to get on their bad side. Because I was never able to find details pertaining to Shocker's ban from Diamond, I don't know if the orders from the original solicitation were canceled due to the delays, though I strongly suspect that to be the case. One of the many reasons I think this is the case is because of a certain detail contained in nearly every story that I've ever heard about people getting Shocker toys from comic shops, which was rare, I might add. Every shop that I know of that carried his product had in-person dealings with Jeff Beckett Jr. He would show up with a sweaty armful of toys and proceed to strong-arm shop owners into buying and stocking his product. This is the only way I've ever heard of Beckett's toys ever getting directly into comic shops. But again, because I wasn't able to track down concrete details on Shocker's ban from Diamond, I can't say for sure if those initial orders were or weren't fulfilled. Even if Diamond did fill those initial orders, which I don't believe to be the case anyways though, this left Shocker and Beckett in a strained and tenuous position with the line of action figures it had taken them so long to produce. The Indie Spotlight series was a line of action figures specifically based around and geared towards comic fans, but they didn't have any form of distribution to comic shops. Newsstand sales were ceasing to be altogether, in what rare cases they still existed, and comic readers had almost exclusively flocked to their local shops for their weekly fix for over a decade by this time. With product in hand after years of struggle and strife, Beckett was left with few places to turn when it came to selling the line he'd worked so long to get out. As with his licenses, Beckett once again seemingly turned his back on his independent roots and began desperately trying to put together deals with large chains and department stores. Always the smooth talker, he succeeded in getting distribution with several of the heavy hitters of the day, including Hastings, KB Toys, and the mother of them all, Toys R Us. For years to come, Beckett would boast and brag about how he'd had his toys carried by Toys R Us, but for the record, first of all, that company was on their last leg at the time. And number two, I stalked my local KBs and Toys R Us and never saw a single Shocker toy. I can't say for sure, but I get the feeling Beckett was basically strolling into his local department stores with cases of toys, selling the figures where and however he could, and trying to play it off like Shocker was this big national brand. Again, I've nothing to back up this assertion, but after a lot of reading and research, this is basically the only reason that I can think of that companies like this would ever even contemplate doing business with someone who had such a compromised reputation in the public eye. Regardless of whether they were carried nationally or not, one thing is definitely not in question though. There were extremely limited quantities of these toys produced. As with all things Shocker, the water is extremely muddy when it comes to their history. Beckett was most certainly spreading half-truths and outright lies when it came to the company, attempting to put a positive spin on things, while there was a growing number of outspoken people online that were trying to literally tear the company apart, doing anything in their power to make sure that Beckett and his nefarious schemes were put to a stop once and for all. I've never been able to find great details about their release or the numbers that were produced, as Beckett kept all of that pretty close to his chest, but considering that Beckett actually ended up withholding product from the people who were paying him to produce it to sell, I think it's fairly safe to say the quantities of figures produced was relatively small. With toys to finally sell, Beckett was managing to turn a tidy profit from the endeavor at this point. There was a big problem though. He owed money and toys to a lot of people. As I mentioned, some people like Rob Schraub, Jim Valentino, and Terry Moore eventually got some toys after hounding Beckett for extended periods of time about it, and they were the lucky ones. I think Jim Valentino basically summed up the best outcome for anyone who got suckered into participating in the Indie Spotlight series best when he said, quote, "I got the samples, yes. No money. It was not a pleasant experience." Rob Schraub has also famously said that he had such a negative experience with Shocker Toys and Jeff Beckett Jr. that it essentially soured him from continuing with any further Scud merchandise. While it had always been a smaller, more niche book, Scud had increasingly found a welcome home in the pop culture zeitgeist because Schraub and company produced an astounding amount of merchandise and other promotional material for the character. That all came to a screeching halt when Schraub dealt with Beckett apparently though, and I get the feeling he wasn't alone. While few have ever spoken publicly about Beckett's abuse of trust and outright fraud, I discovered a few very good reasons for this. When I released the original version of this video more than a year ago, a user, Altworld Studios, shared a story with me that really illuminates just how much of this entire tale we're probably not hearing, and just as importantly, why. Altworld started by saying they had been one of the few companies ever, quote, banned from buying Shocker merchandise after a rather unpleasant back and forth having to do with some Shockinis. As it turned out, Altworld purchased the toys, which they actually said they still kind of liked, but hadn't been able to sell. They subsequently gave them away at a convention, and when they shared that fact, and that they hadn't been able to sell them as the reason for this unannounced giveaway, way publicly online, Beckett went absolutely ballistic. Not only did he ban Altworld from ever purchasing or carrying Shocker merchandise again, but he then proceeded to threaten them, saying they were slandering Beckett and Shocker's good name. Beckett then began a 3-month campaign of what I can only describe as harassment bordering on stalker-like behavior. It seems that around this time, Beckett had discovered that you could use a person's internet provider or email service to report them for using it to harass people. This kind of thing is obviously designed for people who are sending out pornographic, violent, or otherwise illegal images and otherwise malicious messages. Because the back and forth about the Shockinis had transpired via email, Beckett spent 3 months reporting Altworld to their email and internet providers, claiming Altworld was using their service to, quote, harass Beckett as well as defame his company. After Altworld shared this story with me, I did a little looking around. I quickly discovered that Altworld was in actuality far from the only one targeted by Beckett during this time. It seems that after discovering this tactic, Beckett began to employ it against any number of individuals sharing anything short of glowing sentiments about his company. He even successfully had an article outlining his misdeeds taken down from Bleeding Cool, who he alleged were one of the ringleaders of the roving online gangs out to destroy Shocker and their reputation. This leaves little doubt that many of the smaller independent creators Beckett was working with and took advantage of probably haven't spoken out due to a fear of being harassed online and possible legal repercussions. At least according to Jeff Beckett, that is. During my research, I actually discovered several stories of Beckett attempting to bully and scare people into silence by threatening legal action. Despite these attempts to silence his detractors, however, Beckett had dug himself and the company a hole I don't think there was any getting out of by the time they finally managed to get the Indie Spotlight series out in 2009. Like I said, they may not ever be remembered as a great toy company, and Jeff Beckett Jr. may not ever be remembered as a great man, but they will always be remembered as a great and true lasting monument to failure. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did enjoy what you saw, hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. Share these videos with your friends, and if you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you hog smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind the scenes posts, exclusive content like uncut interviews, and you can even get your name in the credits. If Patreon is not your thing, but you still want to support the channel, have no fear. After 2 years of fighting with YouTube, I can finally offer membership right here on YouTube. Just click the little join button and make sure to select the tier and perks that fit you best. You can also make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description below as well. If that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. As always, this video was made possible by the Jerk Broadcasting Service as well as generous grants from the Patreon members, Ko-Fi donations, and YouTube members you see on the screen now. I'd like to seriously thank every single one of you who has chosen to support the channel. I think the quality of the videos has really been improving, and I just really hope I'm doing you all proud. Most importantly, I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. Thanks again for sticking with me, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only 2 things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.